And then the intro. Hello, we're back, and the please stand by is still working. We're please standing by. Yeah, we're back after a few months, a little hiatus. It hasn't been that long. It's been a few months, I think.
February, March
this year. What are we now? July, June, whatever. A few months.
Time flies.
We were just thinking about stuff. It took a long time to think about stuff.
Yeah,
you know?
think of the next show.
Yeah, this is going to be a really good one. It took us like 4 months to think about it. So,
but we also revamped our studio, as you can see.
Yes.
So we were spending some time doing that.
Got some.
Mr. Scott
tricks.
is also here in the control room.
That's him.
On screen.
He's freaking out about lots of things.
Shout out to who have we got on the? We've got a few people there already. Sorry to keep you waiting, guys. We were actually streaming the show already, we thought, and doing the show, but it wasn't streaming. But here we are at take 2. Let's see if we can get... Okay, there we go. We're getting some feedback. They can hear us now.
Alrighty.
Okay.
Hello, looking good, guys. Yes, awesome. Y'all are looking good too in the chat room. Feel free to chat away, and if you've got any questions, Scotty's going to keep an answer on any questions or any comments, anything that's worth bringing up. So feel free. Yeah. So what are we talking about today? Well, the show title.
Well, 2 major things we think worthy of discussion. There's been a lot more noise recently about. It's as if it suddenly became acceptable speech again. The Wuhan Lab Theory, the origins of this whole pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
That's approved speech, I believe. This is a pandemic. Yes. Okay. For a year there, we couldn't talk about it. Well, you could, but you could risk, sanction on social media.
Right.
Whether you were a big, high-profile, small guy, little guy, anyone talking about it, it was not to be talked about. Now, apparently, it's fine. Brought to people's attention, most famously recently by comedian Jon Stewart, going on his very funny rant on the Stephen Colbert Show, where he goes, the obvious possible elephant in the room
is that
the virus outbreak begins in Wuhan, China. There's a top lab there that researches respiratory coronaviruses.
Right.
So let's talk about it.
Yeah.
That's the main topic I suppose we're going to lead with. We also want to follow up on probably I think the last thing we discussed, which was the
Capitol riot.
9/11 times 1,000.
9/11 times a million.
A million. It was a million.
It was the worst.
Capitol Hill insurrection that how do you say the word? Ignominiously sent Trump, former president, I was going to say former president Joe Biden, former president Donald Trump packing with his tail between his legs.
Right. Into obscurity.
Total obscurity. Except he's kind of making a bit of a comeback this week, so we're also going to touch on that. So how do we do all this, Joe? Though we're live streaming right on the YouTube.
Right.
The contention for our main topic is that this is now acceptable speech again.
To talk about the possibility that the pandemic was caused by human tweaked virus from China. And it's okay to talk about that now, because it wasn't okay to talk about it for for the past year at least, right? Maybe about 1 year ago, a bit more, March, April. Western governments were more or less openly talking about the possibility of that, but then very quickly that was clamped down on, and it was no.
Yes, it's just like
it's a conspiracy theory. It's crazy.
The
it's
World
wrong.
Health Organization, CDC, and Facebook sort of worked in tandem to nix, or to at least put up warning messages. Don't go there.
Right, and there were Fauci emails that were leaked. Fauci's emails, Saint Fauci's emails were recently leaked. Showing that at the beginning of the pandemic,
they took the theory very seriously.
He took it very seriously, and it was in those inside circles. It was seen as the idea that it was human tweaked, a human created virus was taken seriously, but then very quickly, no. Fauci himself called it, well, basically poo-pooed it, suggested it was completely ridiculous to suggest that, and then social media took that as a hint, took it very strongly, as a strong hint, and they clamped down on anyone for the past year plus mentioning anything like that on social media, to the point of actually giving people bans and removing content, etc. But now, within the past,
couple of months, and with a kind of crescendo, an increasing tempo. So in recent weeks and even days, more and more, I'm thinking this is getting traction again in the
Right.
West.
right, to the point,
That's the only reason we want to talk about it. I mean, we're not going to actually sit here and discuss viruses, what they can and can't do. Who the hell knows? You know, we watch the media and what governments say about these big topics, and that's why it's of interest to us, and we think it would be of general interest to everyone else. Hence, we want to talk about it from the point of view of geopolitics,
right.
broad scale geopolitics.
As in, okay, the debate right now, that's an open debate and an allowed debate now, and it's allowed speech now to talk about this virus being
In the framing of it being USA versus China.
human-made. Okay, so
Roughly speaking.
Okay, you can talk about it being human-made now, but the whole focus, at least in the West and the Western media, is that it was made in China. And we're saying that that is just a continuation of a kind of geopolitical war, I suppose you call it, or a conflict, non-violent, non-physical conflict between the great powers, basically, over the past X number of years.
Let me go A, B, C, D, right? Definition of geopolitics, Encyclopedia Britannica. Geopolitics is the analysis of geographic influences on power relationships in international relations. Put simpler, geopolitics is widely employed as a loose synonym for international politics. That's it. Okay, so then what is politics? Well, one of the most famous theorists, or at least one of the most widely cited people from the early 19th century, which everyone who's gone to university in studying anything to do with international relations knows about, is Karl von Clausewitz. And he's the one who said war is the continuation of politics by other means.
Right.
I.e.,
So
it's everyday politics, and occasionally there's a war, and that's just politics erupting into. And similarly, it's the same on the broader scale. Geopolitics.
well, you could turn it around and say politics is a continuation of war by other means.
Exactly. Without having to resort
To physical violence.
And thus, geopolitics is the rivalry between great powers without, obviously, going to war. Everything short of war. Well, what does that include? Well, everything. That's why a geopolitical analysis of the big events in our world, of which the COVID pandemic is sort of the most recent and biggest at the time, at the current time, we want to shed light on it from that point of view only, the broadest possible one, because you've clearly got, now that it is acceptable speech again, one variant of Lab Leak and a Chinese counterpoint. The Chinese counterpoint we don't hear about so much. We'll hear it at the end of our discussion.
Yeah.
But
just let's just put geopolitics, what we're talking about, how we're putting the pandemic in the frame of geopolitics. At least, it certainly plays into that to a significant degree, especially now that they've allowed for open discussion of the idea that China is directly responsible, which is obviously a serious attack and a smear. Well, you could say it's a smear. If it's not true, it's a smear on China. But it fits very directly into that idea of great powers waging war on each other by non-physical means. And an example of that, for example, over the past, obviously it's been going on for decades, right? It's been a mainstay of global politics for a long time, that kind of information war, let's say. But an example of it, or a few examples over the past number of years, we can look at, for example, in China, the Uyghurs, the accusations against China.
that is committing genocide against its
By
Muslim
Western powers.
population.
And we have, we can show one example of an article on China and Uyghur, Scotty, if you just throw that up. Credible case China carrying out genocide. So the accusation against it's a pretty strong accusation of genocide against another country by their by one of their peers.
And you
or
can
opponents.
notice it's not a definitive claim in the phrasing of that headline. Yet everyone in the West has by now some, oh, yeah, I've heard about that genocide.
Right.
So everyone knows, in quotes,
Right.
about it.
So that's one example. Some people might think that's just a kind of humanitarian topic or a
Right, on its own.
civil rights topic, whatever. But no, we'd put that in the frame of geopolitics, i.e., Western powers attacking one of U.S. Russian intelligence assets. If you just throw that one up, Scotty, Putin Skripal's. There's a bunch of headlines.
Who can forget this?
Look at that picture of Putin there. How can we go to Putin's World Cup now? Because this was happening right at the time where the World Cup, the football World Cup, was being played in Russia. Will the royals even go now? And even UK politicians. And here's an example of it being straying into domestic politics, where it was used in the media by certain, elements of the media organizations to try and. Obviously, they're defaming Russia and Putin, or attacking Russia and Putin, but they're also attacking opposition politicians, accusing them of being friends with Putin, who's obviously an evil killer for sending these two Russian intelligence assets to. Everybody remembers Novichok, right? And the deadly kind of poison, whatever it was, that they supposedly spread around at small Salisbury. In the UK. And the last one then obviously was a few years before that, and just before the events in Ukraine, was Putin again in the crosshairs of the West.
MH17.
Over the shooting down of MH17, and headlines like that, Putin's killed my son. And actually that's not the son involved. That is actually, beside that headline, is at the time George Windsor, i.e. the first child of William and Kate, the Queen's grandchildren. So I mean, that's you have to wonder about the juxtaposition of those two, that image and that headline. But anyway, those are three examples of global events that some people might see as just either a human rights or just a disaster, an accident, unintended, that are very much used by in this case, Western powers to attack and smear in the information war of the geopolitical war and the information arena of the geopolitical war, to attack and to smear their enemies. So we're just putting those out there as examples of how this has been ongoing for a long time, but these are just recent examples, and how and as a reason why we put the pandemic, especially now that China is being smeared. You could say, because there's no hard evidence yet, right, that China is responsible for the pandemic, but China is, to all intents and purposes, being accused of being responsible for most people around the world have gone through and lived through over the past year or 14 or 15 months. So, yeah, and I suppose the point about all of that we should mention in all of those cases that we just, in those three cases we gave, is that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the claims that were being made against China and Russia in those cases were not true, or at the very most they were an exaggeration, or a spinning,
yes,
or a manipulation of the data in order to make them look bad.
Yeah.
So if that's the way it's proceeded over many years, then if we put the pandemic and the accusation against China of them being responsible for the pandemic in that frame, which we see no reason not to, then there's a good reason to, at the very least, look at whether or not there's spin on this latest claim of China being responsible for the pandemic. So we're going to look at that a little bit and see where it goes. But go ahead.
Yeah. No, you said the point very well. I mean, these issues are at once true. You can look in and zoom in, and indeed there's a hotspot in Ukraine. There's a civil war going on there. Before you even start to take sides, the Uyghur issue you mentioned, there's also the Hong Kong protests, pro-democracy protests in China, on China's doorsteps,
right,
whatever.
Exactly.
The point isn't whether or not one version per se is true, or you can take the issue and try to find it, tried to look at it objectively. The point is generally that the great powers will leverage a hotspot,
right,
for geopolitical reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it goes as far as actually fomenting violence in order to accuse.
It can go. It can go very far. It did go to war levels in Syria.
Right.
Proxy war.
Right. Yeah.
Shy of the great powers actually firing on each other.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the most
So
extreme.
yeah,
level.
what I was saying is it goes as far as actually one power fomenting violence or some kind of disturbance or civil disturbance in the country of their enemy, and then accusing their enemy for the way that they respond to that. So,
Right.
none of that's. I hope none of that's controversial or censorship worthy. Us saying stuff like that. This is pure politics, right? Okay,
it's
we're just
pure
checking.
politics.
Just checking.
It's pure,
So,
pure politics.
So
just a
it's
quick
done that.
note here. If you look at the screen now,
Is that how we appear?
That's how we appear, and I
Awesome.
thought it was just the Chrome screen capture, but apparently we're well beyond that. So I'm not sure. We had a power flicker.
Is our
and-
audio okay?
Yeah, apparently the audio is crystal clear, but the stream is the video stream is.
Super.
Brilliant.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Is that censorship? Are we being censored? Is our images being censored? Maybe they just don't like the way we look.
I think
Not
our
what we say.
visuals are too hot for the YouTube, maybe.
Maybe we just burned YouTube because we're so hot. Yeah.
Except that it's.
Because so many million people are watching this.
Yeah. We broke the YouTube.
Stream's current bitrate is higher than the recommended bitrate.
Okay,
Yeah.
Scotty's going to try and get us back online visually, which I hope happens because
Yeah. Anyway.
we've had a crew of ninja decorators here decking this place out to a T, and they've worked so hard. So we hope that you get to see the full. Oh, there's me. Is that me back?
Probably not.
No, it's still.
You're still
It
pink.
shows
Still.
up here what we've.
That's
yeah.
a bummer. Well, look, to people listening for now, we're going to have our own copy of the show, full visuals, the lot, which we'll upload separately elsewhere, and you'll be able to see the
Yeah.
whole
So we'll just
thing.
carry on.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so Wuhan Lab Theory. I mean, the return.
Pretend it's a podcast.
I was trying to find roughly where this began as acceptable speech. There is no real start point because as early as, for example, 60 Minutes Australia publishes this really in-depth investigative report titled, "Was COVID-19 Made Inside a Chinese Lab?" in April this year.
Right.
It's on YouTube. It has 3 million views. YouTube's fine with that. Okay. Then there were some more noises into May. I found a Deutsche Welle German report citing Biden's White House making what seemed to be their initial calls for a new international investigation into Wuhan Lab origin theory. Okay. But the real starter point, I think, is earlier in June when the G7 meets in the
Right.
UK, when it's formally written into their G7 communique or meeting report. Among other things, it did say that it's calling on China to, quote, allow international investigators into its Wuhan lab. And to bring the point home, this wasn't just, a quiet statement among many other things that were said. To bring the point home, Biden in his press conference in England 2 weeks ago stated that while he couched it in terms of, well, the US intelligence community is uncertain, we are open to this pandemic having begun as an experiment gone awry in a laboratory. We have footage of Biden saying this. Maybe we should play that. There's no equivocating
Put on Floppy Joe.
the claim.
Floppy Joe.
Yeah. That might be hate speech. Sorry.
I think it's the
Where's Floppy Joe?
Rumble video. That'll be it there, yeah.
Okay. hang
We'll just
on.
listen to the first minute or so.
Let me put it up here.
You've never seen anything like this for fat loss.
Oh,
There's
Jesus.
a new
Oh,
powerful
guys,
fat loss
guys,
solution
Papa.
that's helping me.
Skip.
cited a variety of fronts on China, everything from human rights, the origin of the COVID virus, Taiwan. What do you think China needs to do to ease tensions?
I think China has to start to act more responsibly in terms of international norms on human rights and transparency. Transparency matters across the board. And I think the idea that, for example, one of the things I raised and others raised, I wasn't the only one who raised this at the G7, is that we don't know, we haven't had access to the laboratories to determine whether or not, and I have not reached a conclusion because our intelligence community is not certain yet, whether or not this was a consequence of from the marketplace of a bat and interfacing with animals in the environment that caused this COVID-19, or whether it was an experiment gone awry in a laboratory.
Okay, cut it there, Scotty. An experiment gone awry in a laboratory. Okay, so that's Floppy Joe speaking abroad.
Interfacing with a bat.
That's him abroad. Okay, so you think, well, it's still okay. That's acceptable speech among acceptable people, high-level circles. But no, it was a follow-up. His national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, then went on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace. That's the next thing I want to play. It's another 40 seconds or so, and he made it very clear what their point is in calling for this new investigation and suspecting China of having
Next video.
released the Kraken on this. So let's see. It's going to be on my Twitter account.
Right
There it is.
What Joe Biden did in Europe this week was rally the democratic world to speak with a common voice on this issue. For the first time since COVID broke out, President Trump wasn't able to do it. President Biden was. He got the G7 to endorse a statement saying in unison that China must allow an investigation to proceed within its territory. And it is that diplomatic spade work, rallying the nations of the world, imposing political and diplomatic pressure on China, that is a core part of the effort we are undertaking to ultimately face China with the stark choice. Either they will allow, in a responsible way, investigators in to do the real work of figuring out where this came from, or they will face isolation in the international community.
Okay.
That's
interesting.
In Europe this
That's interesting because, I mean, what has the US been trying to do over the past, I don't know how long, put it back 10, 20 years? They've been trying in various different ways to put pressure on China and to one extent or another, isolate it in the eyes of the international community, i.e. the West, I suppose, or the West plus, and get them to put pressure on China for China to behave in a way, maybe primarily in Asia in terms of its military expansion, but probably in various different other ways, in order to get it to come to heel, basically, and do what they want. Now, this is again, this is an explanation of why we place this whole pandemic business, and certainly the way the Western powers are dealing with it, in respect to accusing China of being responsible for it. It fits into the frame of the long-standing geopolitical shenanigans, right?
Yeah.
But there is an interesting point about this, which is that we've talked about already, about it being censored for a while. You weren't allowed to say it. It was roundly condemned to say, not that China did it. That wasn't the point. The point that was kind of like taboo to utter was that it was leaked from a lab. And the reason, so ordinarily you would think they would be all over this. Western powers would be all over this. If it's an opportunity to smear and defame and isolate internationally China, that they would have been right out of the gates. They would have been pushing this angle, but they didn't. They quashed it from, kind of killed it in the cradle almost. Back in February and March last year, when it first raised its head, and for a whole year you weren't allowed to talk about it. So why is that? Why did they not exploit that opportunity to defame and put pressure on China? Because
China has a counter theory,
right,
which they put together early on, initially leaked actually through alternative media circles, at least in the English-speaking Western press, which MSM in the West then had to respond to. It was a global research article by a guy called, I think, Larry. Oh, I've forgotten his name. I'd never heard of him before. It might have been a pseudonym for something else.
Okay.
But it was straight up, it was a conspiracy theory because it made a number of leaps. It just connected the dots on a few things and posed it as a question mark. And this got traction in the West in the response to it because it was getting shared on social media. So the MSM said, well, hang on. I said, what's this about? Well, that's where they explicitly said, well, wait a second. Who has 200 plus bases around the world in which some form of biowarfare research takes place?
and some of them, yeah.
They explicitly mentioned Fort Detrick.
Right.
They suggested that a couple of incidents in the summer of 2019 played into this, making reference to something called the vaping syndrome outbreak.
Right,
In
yeah.
quotes, in the United States.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. There was, if you look back, I mean, people weren't paying attention to it in the summer of 2019. There wasn't. I mean, there were headlines, but there were several reports. Scott, if you just pull up the JPEG of the. Okay, well, that's not it, but.
Hang on, I'm still looking. Which one is it?
No, not that one.
Oh no, here it
Back,
is.
yeah.
All right, let me
So
stick that up.
vaping-related illness reports have surged to 805. So this is a vaping-related illness that just popped out of nowhere in the summer of 2019 in the US primarily. It
And
was
you see the date there, reported in late September.
right. It was reported in late September, but it was happening over the summer. And the media, quite a few media reports on it. A lot of people, basically similar symptoms to COVID, and it came out of nowhere. And it was, I mean, they claimed it was vaping. It was, people who were coming down with this illness were all vapors. But that's, I mean, if you check into it, it's not actually true. There's a lot of people who had never vaped before, and before and afterwards. There has never been a situation where there was an outbreak of a serious respiratory illness from vaping. Vaping's been going on for a long time, and you never had this before. So it's a bit odd to suddenly for it to spike and cause a certain illness in kind of summer or fall, into the fall of 2019, and then to suddenly go away again. And there's another one there, Scotty, of just before that on the list. Yeah, this one. Respiratory outbreak being investigated at a retirement community. This was in it was in July. It was in June and reported in July, and there were several of these actually at retirement communities where not just residents falling ill, but several of them dying from a similar kind of strange, unusual upper respiratory or respiratory illness, and then goes away again. So. This is just as, tentative evidence to be looked into, to be thought about in terms of the Chinese riposte to the American accusation that the novel SARS-CoV-2 virus originated in a lab in China. It's plausible that it could have originated elsewhere. Possibly in America, possibly, who knows, elsewhere. But anywhere else, there's lots. Well, there's not many labs that are doing that level of research and have that level of investigative ability or research ability into those kind of viruses. But there are a few, and there's at least one or two in the US.
Yeah.
And so that's evidence. Let's say some evidence, tentative evidence of it, or at least as plausible as the evidence that it came from China. Is that it may have come from somewhere in the US. And a reason why initially the US and Western powers wanted to lock down any discussion of it being a lab leak until it seems, the China virus idea had gained enough traction, and it was a kind of done deal. If anybody's going to discuss this virus being made by human hands in a lab or tweaked by human hands in a lab, then it's going to, all the focus is going to be in China. There's enough messaging has already been put out there that, we're in the clear, basically.
Yeah.
So, and of course, like we said, as we've been saying, it falls into the whole geopolitical information war frame, basically.
Yeah. And there's an incredible irony at the heart of this as well. Trump was all about pushing this narrative throughout last year.
Right.
But no, we went quiet on that. Trump talking about it, no, that's bad. But the very same thing really is now okay because it's Biden. It's almost like, okay, this is now acceptable speech because that guy isn't ranting and raving about it. We heard Jake Sullivan boast and claim that for the first time, and he specifically has said Trump wasn't able to do this. Biden has managed to rally the Western world
Right.
to this position, to an agreed position.
Of attacking China. But who's the man who was going China for and coined the phrase the China virus, I think. Sure, was that not enough of of an attack on China? Why was Trump's clear attack on China an accusation against China of being the source of this virus and him demanding that they have to pay billions in reparations? Why was that not enough? I mean,
it's no different.
How do you
In foreign policy terms, it's no different.
Right.
His position and Biden's position.
But domestically,
the only thing is that it's not Trump doing it.
right?
We, quote unquote, have control of this narrative now. I don't think this was intended, but this is so well stitched up now. This is why I wanted to actually talk about this today. Over the course of the last 15 months, in part because you were not allowed to talk about it, it became one of the most talked about things among quote unquote dissidents. Dissident public opinion in the West all heavily went to, okay, they're covering something up, and it's China. Now, skip forward a bit. It's the US election and the run up to it. Joe Biden got the moniker Beijing Biden partly because of his son's business links
Right.
to Chinese companies, but also because of other social issues that were going on with the NBA and Chinese money and what could or couldn't be said about
TikTok.
China, TikTok. You know, all this was brewing. And what was going on in people's minds throughout this crazy past 15 months was they're covering something up. And China seems to be a part of it. It's, do you know what I mean? In the quiet, where people were not allowed to say certain things,
Right.
they were very much encouraged between the lines subtly to think certain things, such that by the time this is let out of the gates again, most recently, you've got the left and the right, the working class and the upper class, the liberals and the conservatives are all of one mind. China did it.
Right, which is
It's unintended, I think, but it's an amazing outcome.
Yeah. and
So
it's-
when Biden is going to the G7 and claiming, well, we're a united front on this,
Yeah.
he's right. And much, if not all of their domestic populations are in agreement with that. It's an
Yeah.
incredible outcome, and it's incredibly successful.
Yeah. Although you have to say that conservatives in the US are more, have been on the anti-China shtick more strongly and for longer than any
Yes, here it does seem like this is
liberals.
the Biden presidency is kind of Johnny come lately on this, as
Right.
if they're just shoring it up now.
Yeah. And you wouldn't have as much outcry or as much nationalism, let's say, obviously from liberals over, in terms of anti-China rhetoric, right? Because they've got the kind of, I suppose, liberal sensitivities to, anti-racism and all that kind of stuff. So you can't go too far in defaming or demeaning China and the Chinese.
Which may speak to why this was unacceptable speech while Trump was president.
Right.
Because he's a live wire.
Right.
And could do destructive things.
he's a racist,
And the
yeah.
Chinese responded just as vociferously to him.
As they did to
Mr.
Biden.
Liar, they called him,
Yeah.
like back in February this year, or January, when he was still president.
Yeah.
Whereas now, in the formal G7 communique and in other media reports and other recent leaks, it's still couched and hedged in careful terms.
Yeah.
But you cannot mistake the overall position, which is between the lines, dear Westerners, China did it.
Yeah.
But let's be careful about how we say. Remember, we're only using that. This is their geopolitical thinking going on here.
Right.
China did it. That's the message. But don't anyone be getting hot-headed about this.
Don't be turning nationalist on us.
We've got this under control. We're going to use this to defend the Western realm's interests
Right.
as a
And to put-
whole.
and to
There'll be
put
no
pressure on China.
nationalists striking out on their
Right.
own. France isn't going to do its own thing. The US isn't going to do its own thing.
Yeah.
It's back now. It's in-house, in quotes. We got this. That's the message.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's kind of sad that it's that happens. Where anything bad that happens in the world that affects, especially when it affects Americans as well, that it always has to be the other. It's always the other. The narrative eventually always resolves out to this has nothing to do with anything that could have happened or been caused by any, powers or influences within the US.
It's a
And
strong, almost instinctual flex.
and that's across the board, obviously. That's liberals, conservatives, whatever political
Yes.
stripe. They all are kind of primed in a certain sense to always look outside and to the other. And we give some examples there of at least of there being a reasonable enough case for investigation into whether or not, okay, now that everybody accepts that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was manufactured in a lab, probably, or at least possibly, well then let's keep the possibilities going and not limit it to China, because there is a lot of evidence. I mean, we give a little bit, but there's plenty more that that the whole about when the virus may have been present, when it was, where it was spread, where it actually came from. The Chinese government have put out information about it possibly having originated, and they even mentioned the military games that took place in October
in Wuhan.
2019 in Wuhan, where 200 US military personnel were brought over, and they have, I think, some elements within the Chinese government have actually expressly suggested that it may have originated with those military personnel. So, I mean, at this point, there is no hard evidence. I mean, you had Biden demanding that China open up its labs for and its country. Yeah, they'd love it to open up itself in that way to American.
It's a ridiculous proposition, because everyone understands that doesn't happen. The same would not be asked of or expected of the United States
Right.
labs.
Or it's ridiculous in the sense that those labs are already open, in the sense that there's very detailed and intricate collaboration
Exactly.
between Chinese, those kind of Chinese research institutes, medical research or viral research institutes, and in China and in the West.
Exactly.
I mean, there's the whole Fauci thing, being accused of giving money to that
It's
institute.
not accused.
It
It went through normal channels.
Right. It's normal.
National Institute of Health, U.S. government agency funding, in part for some projects, went to the Wuhan lab.
Right.
That's because the Wuhan lab isn't a Fort Detrick. It isn't a top secret military
Right. It's a
thing.
relatively open, yeah.
It's trying to be open. They sought to get the World Health Organization accreditation, I think. Yeah, I think they're the regulatory body for the UN.
Mm-hmm.
So that it's classified as a BSL-4 lab.
Mm-hmm.
That entails it be at least partly open. American researchers were flying back and forth. They worked there
Right.
at various times. And that's
So they
partly
never opening
why
it.
it's such a head-wrecking thing. Because
Why would you open it up when it's already open up? You've been there.
And it's also farcical further still, because you see, these noises in earnest, at least in the background, started in February this year, I think, January, February, because the World Health Organization did a joint investigative report with the Chinese government, in which they were in the lab in
Right.
Wuhan. They've already published a report. This is an effort to say, we don't accept those results. You're going to have to do a redo.
Right.
But it's a bluff, because the WHO, the Chinese government, went as far as everyone accepts are the standards. The US and its allies are asking for more. They're asking for something that
Yeah.
nobody
Nobody would do.
Salisbury would never have been opened up.
The reason he's saying that, the reason, what's his name, Jake
Sullivan.
Sullivan, yeah. The reason he's saying that is just to put pressure. That's the putting pressure
Yeah.
on China. It's like a disingenuous demand. Like, he knows and they know that your demand is ridiculous. You already have access to that lab. You've already collaborated with us on that lab. What do you mean open it up to our investigations? You know what goes on there. In fact, you could tell the world a lot about what goes on there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what goes on. And while you're at it, tell them what goes on in your own labs.
Yeah. Yeah. At
So
the
it's all-
time, in
yeah.
January 2020, the Chinese government gave 30 daily briefings to the United States government. This was above and beyond any requirements it has, any obligations it had to the World Health Organization about what it was finding. They were in daily contact. They went out of their way to be open, at least according to any previous known standards.
Right.
That's why we're saying COVID-19 on the whole is geopolitics. It's the topic itself is one thing, but the use of it
Right.
is something else.
Yeah. And those topics as they come up like that are always used in that way. That's the primary value, at least
It
for
always
the
comes
great
back to
powers
this.
and governments, the major governments around the world. The major value to them in those kind of crises or events that happen is an opportunity to, to achieve advancement or gains on your geopolitical objectives against your peer competitors. So,
And what might that be? Well, Jake Sullivan said we seek to isolate. It's a threat. It's an ultimatum. Either do as we say, or we will isolate you on the international stage. What does that mean in practice?
Well, what it means in practice is do something that I know you can't do, or we're going to isolate you. I mean, that's a real.
Okay,
it's a real maneuver. Like he's saying, open yourself up and, it's kind of like it's like the question of when did you
stop beating your wife?
Stop beating your wife? Basically, it's give us something that I know you can't give, and you know what you can't give, or we're going to do this thing to you. I.e., we're going to do this thing to you. We're going to rally the international community to put pressure on you for other objectives, not to reveal anything about this virus, because we already know, everything we need to know about it, its origins, etc. We're going to put pressure on you to achieve other objectives.
Yeah, namely to sully you in the eyes of people everywhere.
But to achieve an objective.
Yeah, and that, I suppose,
Put pressure on.
to put pressure on. I suppose the golden ideal of that objective is regime change.
Ultimately, yeah.
Ultimately,
Yeah.
I recall. Do you remember when this all began? There were some amazing headline choices in like the Financial Times, the Economist. This is the end of the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese economic miracle is finished, doomed, just total doom. I think they were saying, well, shit, maybe it was an honest guess. This really is bad news for them. But I think there's an awful lot of wishful thinking as to what would be an ideal outcome here if we derail China's rise economically, therefore its influence on international standards globally. That was said explicitly in the G7. Listen, there's going to be no shift, no change in the status quo of how the international rules are set. That's what we're trying to keep a lock on.
Right.
So it's enormous wishful thinking, and
I just think it's sad that, like I was saying, that when it all comes out in the wash, the final conclusion or the final narrative is, like I said, like I was saying before, is that anything bad that happens in the world, and particularly events that negatively impact the American people, it always has to be someone else's fault. It can never originate within the power structures within the US. And that kind of brings us to the Capitol riot. And again, we're going to have to navigate this quite carefully because for some reason, a previous video we did around the time on this was removed from YouTube for some reason, and I have no idea why. Because we're super cool, we're super objective and super balanced and super everything about it. So we were, I think. I'll have to watch it again, but I'm pretty sure we were. And we knew back then that we had to be careful anyway, and we were careful. And so we're going to talk about the Capitol riot again in that context of anything bad that happens in the US is always caused by either something outside of the US or some chosen bête noire or enemy of the establishment within the US, if such a thing exists. Certainly at the time of the Capitol riot, the enemy that had been, already elevated to the status of an enemy well before that was kind of a white nationalists, Proud Boys, whatever.
Alt-right.
White supremacists, whatever they call them, but basically Trump supporters, let's say. They were the ones, and of course they're the ones, Trump, and they're the ones who got...
QAnon supporters.
They're the ones who got the blame, obviously, for the riot and the worst
calamity since World War II, Pearl Harbor.
Since the American
the hyperbole was off the charts.
Yeah, it was worst thing ever. It was, and yeah, I mean, whatever. I'm not going to comment on that. But the stuff that's come to light since then, in terms of the investigation into what actually happened, and who's to blame, and there have been, there was a 5-month report released recently by a bipartisan grouping in the government of Congress and the Senate or whatever into what actually happened, and within that, it has been revealed that there are I can't remember the exact number, but a large number of people who were, and this it also is included in the actual criminal investigations by the FBI and the Justice Department into who was responsible and indicting people and putting some people in prison, etc. But there's quite a large number of what are termed unindicted co-conspirators, and that's a strange thing to happen, to have such a large number of unindicted co-conspirators, because those people aren't named. And
persons 1, 2, 3,
and they're nothing is said about really their involvement. Well, some details are given about their involvement, but very little is known about them. And they're basically never going to be indicted. They're currently unindicted co-conspirators, and they generally won't be indicted in any way, and they won't be publicly named or revealed. And these unindicted co-conspirators played in many cases a central role in the events on Capitol Hill that day. But just as a prelude to what we wanted to just throw out there as a possible food for thought on the Capitol Hill riot in light of this new information, let's just play the SOT report. This is a report that I did in a former incarnation 12 years ago. It's just a part of it.
Flashback.
12 years ago.
Oh my God!
I
Look
don't
at
know
that.
who that is. But
who is that?
He's pretty
Look at that
awesome. He's pretty
suit.
awesome looking.
So
Anyway,
sharp.
just play that. Yeah, yeah. We should start dressing like that again. And
After you.
it's just a few minutes. I'll tell you when to cut it off. Pretty much after the end of the first report on the first case there. But you can go ahead and play it. So first, let's go back to 2006 and the case of the Miami 7 or the Liberty City 7. Do you remember this one? No, of course you don't. That's part of the problem. Liberty City is a neighborhood in Miami City, Florida, and is as close to a black ghetto as you might get in the glorious US of A. Living quietly in a warehouse in Liberty City were 7 intellectually challenged young men who called themselves the Seeds of David, or the Seeds of David, depending on which one you asked. Describing themselves as Christian, Zionist, Muslim, martial artist immigrants, I kid you not, they were quietly awaiting the fulfillment of the biblical end times prophecy. It's not surprising, therefore, to hear that the alleged leader of the group, one Narcille Baptiste, needed psychiatric help, according to his father. But then along comes an undercover FBI agent calling himself Brother Muhammad. Yeah, how original. Using complex psychological profiling, the FBI determined that poor people like money. So Brother Muhammad offered these Christian, Zionist, Muslim, martial artist immigrants $50,000. As it turned out, this, and only this, got the men's attention. Nevertheless, the FBI's Brother Muhammad had an agenda to make terrorists out of these young men, so he probed a little deeper. Would they like to engage in military training? For 50 grand? Sure, said the guys. The only problem is, we don't have any weapons or explosives or anything like that. Hey, we don't even have boots. No problem, says Brother Muhammad. He can get them some boots. So, equipped now with shiny new military boots, how would they feel about taking some pictures of the Sears Tower in Chicago and, say, an FBI building, for example? For 50 grand? Sure, said the guys. The only problem is we don't have any cameras, and by the way, we don't own any cars. No problem, says Brother Muhammad. He can get them a video camera and rent them a car. So now, what about a little Al-Qaeda swearing-in ceremony? For 50 grand? Sure, why not? We really like money. So a few of the men half-heartedly repeat an Al-Qaeda oath. All of these details were either recorded secretly or testified to by the FBI agent afterwards, and then, at the appointed time, the men are arrested and brought to trial. On news of the arrests, 2 Liberty City community activists summed it up by saying that everyone in Liberty City is joking that the guys are going to kick down the FBI building with their new boots, because they didn't have any devices which could have been used to explode. At the time, Knight Ridder News reported that the Justice Department unveiled the arrests with an orchestrated series of news conferences in 2 cities, but the severity of the charges compared with the seemingly amateurish nature of the group raised concerns among civil libertarians, who noted The group had no weapons, no explosives, and yet the government considered the arrests a major announcement. The first 2 trials were a bust. The jury couldn't decide if there was even a case against the men. But the US government persisted, and on the 3rd attempt in 2009, 5 of the men were sentenced to long prison terms for, and I quote, planning to wage a full ground war against the United States. These guys, no boots, no money, no cars, no cameras, nothing, but according to the US government, planning to wage a full ground war against the United States. All of this is for your benefit. You are meant to believe that those guys were planning to wage a full ground war against the United States with nothing but an empty warehouse and an IQ of about 200 between all of them. That'll do. So that's just part of it. I go on in that 12-year-old report to there's several other similar plots, FBI terror plots as they were called at the time. And actually, just pull that up now, Scott, and keep it on the screen for a little minute. The FBI terror plot JPEG. It should be near the beginning.
It's a New York Times article. That one.
Terror plots hatched by the FBI. So if you can see there, it just says, has been narrowly saved from lethal terrorist plots in recent years. The United States has, right? Or so it has seemed, according to the New York Times. A would-be suicide bomber was intercepted on his way to the Capitol. A scheme to bomb synagogues and shoot Stinger missiles at military aircraft was developed by men in Newburgh, New York, and a fanciful idea to fly explosive-laden model planes into the Pentagon and the Capitol was launched in Massachusetts. But all these dramas, according to the New York Times, were facilitated by the FBI, whose undercover agents and informers posed as terrorists, offering a dummy missile, fake C4 explosives, and disarmed suicide vest and rudimentary training. Suspects naively played their parts until they were arrested. There's an Oregon college student, obviously Muslim, thought of using a car bomb to attack a festive Christmas tree lighting ceremony. That's one that I actually deal with in that report. In Portland, the FBI provided a van loaded with 33-gallon drums of inert material, blasting caps, etc., detonator, cord, and gallon. And then basically, whenever the guy appeared, they provided that to him. He's like, again, another fairly, low intelligence kind of guy, a bit naive, probably mentally deranged in some way or other, and they just put him in the place, provide all the details, all the paraphernalia of the terror plot for him, put him in the place, and when he arrives at the place, they jump out, nab him, terror plot done. There's many reports in mainstream news articles over the past, particularly around that time, of the FBI.
Oops.
There goes the doggy, of the FBI. Sorry, we haven't, as you probably figured out, we just put together our studio, and some of it, I blame the studio, put her together for that. Anyway, basically, there's articles that say that basically all of the terror plots that you've heard about that were drip fed to people over the past 10 or 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
Pretty much all of them that you heard about, high-profile ones that were announced by the FBI that led to convictions, were all FBI terror plots. That term, FBI terror plot, it means what it sounds like it means. It means that the FBI orchestrated these terror plots and just used patsies, effectively, to take the fall. So with that history, you use that history. Let's use that history and look at the Capitol riot in that context of the FBI having a very, very long track record. And this doesn't go back 10 or 15 years. This goes back to the Black Panthers in the 60s and 70s. And there were reports, COINTELPRO, of the FBI doing exactly that thing, setting people up in order to look bad. Assuming or intuiting or inferring, whether there's any evidence for it or not, that this group is a potential danger in the future. So let's make them what we think they're going to be in the future.
Implying.
Right now. Huh?
You got inferring wrong with implying.
No, they're inferring that these people are going to carry out, are going to become terrorists, are going to cause a problem or cause problems for America. They're inferring from their behavior, from who they are, that's what they're going to do. Yeah. And they set them up basically and indict them and make them into something that they essentially want them to be, And the FBI has always had to justify its role as a, protector of America from domestic threats, right? If there's no domestic threats, what are you going to do? You got to make some up, right? Or you got to, it's a gray area for sure. I'm not saying that you don't keep tabs on people and all that kind of stuff, but the FBI has gone way beyond that by according to most of the mainstream investigative reports that have looked into this, it's gone way beyond the remit, and it's gone to the point of actually creating terror plots, so-called terror plots of one description or another, that would never have come to anything at all.
Yeah.
So you put that long history going back decades of the FBI's primary function being that, and put the Capitol riot in that context,
Right.
and put it in a shorter context then of everything you know about Russiagate and them trying to unseat Trump and trying to defame him and get rid of him basically right from day one of his presidency, and the FBI being directly involved in that. And then it leads up to the Capitol riot and a group of, again, naive Trump supporters who very plausibly, at least, in this context, could have been led astray by the FBI. I'm saying they could have been led astray by the FBI. And this is where it's sad, where again, the majority, the totality of the American people in this context and many others like we've been talking about should always, at the very least, have the opportunity to look inwards for the source of their problems
Right.
and the suffering that they're experiencing, rather than always outwards. How likely is it that it's always going to be something outwards or some fringe, undesirable aspect of within society that's causing these major problems in your
Right.
country? Who has the power to create those kind of issues and problems that have profound effects and affect profound changes on the way people live their lives? The pandemic being one example. I'm not saying the pandemic was necessary. Well, I'm not saying the pandemic was created with that intention necessarily. But what I'm saying is, that, as we've said before, it's in the context of people should be allowed to and open to looking inwards, not at necessarily the Wuhan laboratory, but a laboratory in the US. If that's if that's allowed to be discussed right now, that the virus was man-made, why does it have to be man-made in China in this context? And this is why this context is extremely important, to have all of this data at your fingertips or available to you in order to understand and interpret events as they happen in the world today.
Yeah.
So
It reminds me of the flex among the American right last summer in reaction to the Black Lives Matter protests, many of which descended into riots in dozens of cities.
Mm-hmm.
And, it wasn't super widely speculated, but it was there. It was all ever present. It was like, China's doing this. China's behind this.
Yeah.
And they went to the point of someone said, "Oh well, this group or another connected with Black Lives Matter has someone on the board who's part of China Friends, some outreach group that involves either Chinese expat community in the US." I think that was it. And that expat community does indeed get funding of some form from China.
Right.
Anyway, the point there was, it was readily and had a lot of traction, spun into, hang on, the commies behind this,
Yeah, but this is the sad thing.
Who wants to destroy America?
Even
they do.
Even the most awake and aware, in a real sense, commentators on social media today seem, and the ones that are based in the US at least, seem to be unable themselves. Even the ones who have all of this information at their fingertips seem to be unable to go there.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking people like Stephen Crowder or anyone in the same vein who are kind of like, not on the left, on the, defending America nationalist kind of politics, nationalist outlook. They still can't, or they still seem to be unable to look at, in a real way, at the influence of the deep state or some element of the power structure in the US as the source of many of these things. Like Stephen Crowder, for example, he's super happy about it being the China virus, and on many other topics where focus should be looked at internally. It's all, on Russia, for example, he tends to believe everything about Putin being evil. Like Putin recently said after the what was it wasn't the G7. What was he at the He wasn't at the G7, but
No.
at the one of his
Well, Biden then, that was a
Biden went to see
prelude to
him, right?
Biden having a summit with
having a summit with him.
Putin.
But at that summit, Putin said that, jokingly, but not jokingly, said he was surprised that when he was asked about, Russian influence in America or something, blah, 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 he jokingly said that he was surprised that the Americans hadn't accused Russia of being behind the Black Lives Matter protests.
Right.
Which is, yeah.
It
To
w-
the extent you think they're good or bad, obviously you don't think that anybody has to be behind it. But if you think they're bad, if you think there's something nefarious about them, then people like many people in the US who would think that Black Lives Matter protests would look negatively on Black Lives Matter protests would never look really internally necessarily. They'd look maybe the Democratic Party supporting them, but they'd be very happy to think that maybe China or Russia or somebody else is doing this to America, that no one in America would ever do this to Americans themselves.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I can imagine their response would be something like, well, hang on a second. It's one thing for there being a track record of terror plots, which went nowhere, but that was the point. But you're talking about Capitol Hill riots, where you cannot say that everyone there, that there was no agency at all on behalf of actual Trump supporters who turned up for what they thought was going to be some kind of revolution.
did they think it was going to be some kind of revolution? You go back to Trump's words that have been oft repeated as evidence that there was no intent for any kind of a storming of the Capitol at that time. That go to the Capitol, make your voices heard, fight like hell. But fight like hell, they tried to spin on that one phrase, fight like hell, as if that meant, break into the Capitol, So I think, like I said, based on this history of how the FBI infiltrates those kind of groups like that they see as, enemies, domestic enemies, basically, they infiltrate them and they run them off the rails. This certainly fits. It's certainly a plausible, in that context, that has been reported by the New York Times. In that context, it's certainly plausible to suggest that the FBI may have been in some way involved. They certainly were. Even Trump's, after Comey was fired, Trump's appointee for FBI director admitted that they are always, for a long time, it's their bread and butter, is seeking to infiltrate into these kind of groups of concern within the US and to neutralize them in some way. But like we said, the way the FBI conducted itself with FBI or with terrorism, domestic terrorism, like from Muslim terrorism, was not just to infiltrate them and to stop it from happening, but to bring the whole thing to fruition and make it look as if, claim that this was actually a plot carried out by people, in this case Muslim wannabe would-be terrorists who were definitely planning to attack America in some way or other. So they took it right to the point of, and in some cases, I mean, there's other reports in some cases where it goes beyond stopping it at the last minute, but it actually carries through to some kind of a fulfillment of the actual attack. So you put the Capitol riot in that context, and you just change Muslim terror group in the US for Proud Boys or white supremacists, and the FBI has been using the same modus operandi, which means that they get involved with them. They have informants, etc., and they take it as far as they need to in order to achieve the end that they want, which is neutralization of the group. And the neutralization of the group really happens when public opinion sways against them. So you have to bring it to a point where these people, it looks like these people are actually a real and credible threat. So they have to be made to look to do something that creates that impression. They can't just be, you can't really, the way I exposed it in that South report, as just a bunch of feckless idiots who were never going to do anything. They have to be made to look like they're a serious threat, and they are capable, willing and able to carry it out, and ideally actually carry something out to make it look real. And just on that point, before we go to anything else or whatever we're going to do next, pull up the Assange JPEG, Scotty. Should be the first one. That one, yeah. So, can we go a bit bigger and...
Oh, wrong window.
So, key accusations in the case against WikiLeaks co-founder Julian Assange, who faces up to 175 years in prison if extradited to the US, are reportedly based on the testimony from a convicted fraudster who admitted to media he was lying. Sigurdur Somethingson is an Icelandic citizen and former WikiLeaks volunteer who became an FBI informant for $5,000. That's all I need to say. He's basically the guy who provided the evidence that the US is using primarily for its case for extradition of Assange to the US and his current continued incarceration. He's the guy who made the claim that Julian Assange told him or encouraged him to hack certain computers, whatever, in the US, certain US computers. He has now admitted that no one ever told him to do that he tried to do it on his own, and that Assange was basically totally free, and that he was, at the time when he made those claims, he was an FBI informant who was a paid FBI informant, or an FBI informant.
Yeah.
And an FBI informant isn't just someone who informs for the FBI. It's usually someone who actually takes action on behalf of the FBI in order to achieve certain FBI goals, which in this case was obviously the imprisonment and kind of shutting up of Julian Assange and
WikiLeaks,
and because of what had happened beforehand, because of the stuff that WikiLeaks had revealed beforehand. So that's another example that ties into it, that basically the FBI was directly involved in that as well, because obviously it's a threat to America if WikiLeaks reveals damaging information about how the US military and US government comports itself in war zones and in general behind the scenes when they release emails and different documentation. So at this point, Julian Assange, that should really, I mean, in any reasonable civil society, he should be immediately released from prison because there's no longer a case to extradite him. And of course, he's not being extradited because the British courts have kind of ruled that he shouldn't be extradited, I think, but he's being held still in Belmarsh prison for some unknown reason.
Probably because they know if it went to trial, it would fall flat. If he went to the United States,
but
it's better that it be caught up in legal no man's land because, well, if it's based on this guy's testimony and that's baseless, well then it goes nowhere.
So there you go.
Poor
that's where we're at. And what about Trump? Has he come back?
I laughed when you suggested that he was, but maybe I'm wrong.
Let's listen.
I gotta say he's enjoying this revival of Wuhan Lab Theory.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's what
I told you. I spent all last year. Nobody listened. Nobody listened to me. I told you China is behind the virus. By the way, they owe us. We're gonna make them pay. China is gonna pay $10 trillion. They owe the world $10 trillion. That's what I heard from him this week.
Yeah, that's what he said. Well, actually, there's a couple of. He had a rally there. He started up his rallies again. I don't know where it's going to go, but it's interesting to a couple of Twitter links there. Yep. Let's hear. There's just a couple of short ones there from what he said.
Oh, he's back giving rallies.
Yeah.
Damn.
Together, we will send Joe Biden and the fake news media. There's a lot of people back there. Look at that. Look at that. Look at that.
Still can't finish a sentence.
No.
Do you miss me? They miss me. They miss me. I know. They look at their bad ratings and they're saying, we miss this guy. I said it was going to happen. I was waiting for them to endorse me, actually. I know that was a big step, but they're going down the tubes. Their numbers are very bad. But together, we will send Biden and the media and all of the people that are so bad to our country, big tech tyrants, a message they cannot ever censor, cancel, or ignore. We will take back the House, we will take back the Senate, and we will take back America, and we will do it soon.
Dude. He's on the campaign trail already. All right, go to the next one. It's just funny as well. It's pretty short. Same rally.
There's never been a movement like it. There has never been. You know, over the years, I've seen people, if they did fairly well in a primary 30 years ago, they become stars fairly well. We won the election twice. And it's possible we'll have to win it a third time. It's possible.
Is that the end of it? Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. Now, I just want to make the point that we're not saying, we don't endorse Trump's message there that he won the election twice. We won the first time, but we're not saying he won the second time necessarily, because I know that's, you know,
He's sure saying that.
he's saying that, and it's on Twitter, and Twitter hasn't censored videos of him saying that, so I assume it's okay.
Yeah,
to
there should have
actually
been
just-
a warning.
Well, I assume it's okay just to report that that's what he said. I'm not saying that we endorse it or we agree with it necessarily, but it's interesting. It's news. It's news commentary, right? It's free speech basically, and it's not hurting anybody. It may be fake news. It may not be. I don't know. Time will tell, because the thing about that tech companies, social media companies, should kind of take a lesson from is, for example, what they've done over the past year, where they censored any commentary on or anybody saying that the SARS-CoV-2 was created in a lab, and then they found out after a year of censorship that actually they shouldn't have been censoring that, because it seems to have been a fairly reasonable thing to say, and it may actually be the most likely of the two possible sources or causes of the origin of the virus. So they should be careful, I think, about censoring what appears to be, and as long as it's presented in a reasonable way, this may or may not be true. It's not a good idea to censor that when it's a reasonable assumption, especially, you know, you want to avoid having egg in your face multiple times, where you censor something and then suddenly it's true again, and then you censor again. Oh, it's true. Censor. Oh, it's true. You know, you don't want to get into that kind of situation, I suppose, because you'd lose all credibility, right? Anyway.
So you think he's making a comeback, but they have him
Well,
completely under wraps. I mean, he's not on social media. You said that he has
that's a
recently
Rumble,
started.
official Rumble channel, yeah.
Okay. And you
So-
think that's campaigning with a view to rerunning?
It's pretty early start, like, but you know, 5 months into Biden's presidency, it's a bit. It's not really giving Biden much of a chance, you know. But why not? I mean, maybe you start early. What else is he going to do? Like, he's either going to go away for good, or he's going to keep doing these things. I mean, why would he start another rally like that if he didn't intend to keep them going, you know, and make of it what he can, you know? We'll see.
Them's fighting words. What about Biden's fighting words?
About what?
I don't think we can play it, but when he talking about was he talking about gun laws and people's Americans' attachment to the Second Amendment?
Yep.
And he suggested that if they ever want to challenge government, they're going to need
More than AR-15s.
F-15s and maybe some nukes.
They're going to need F-15s and some nukes, yeah.
I bet that went down well.
Yeah, stupid thing to say, but whatever. It's kind of true in a certain sense, but it's not a good argument for trying to take away people's guns. I mean, you know, you should have a better argument for taking away people's guns than...
Or to bring the country back together after extremely fractious spell.
Yeah.
What
I don't-
happened to making peace with?
I don't think they're interested in that, really, are they? It's too far gone, I think. I think they realise that there's fundamental differences that really aren't going to be papered over, you know, or they can be papered over, but that's it. There'll be differences. You have to do something else if you really want to unite people. But I mean, people need to unite themselves. They don't need to be united by politicians. They should ideally have the ability to find common ground among themselves. You know what I mean, and understand who their common enemy is, if such exists. You know. Anyway,
Amen.
So, listen, we're probably going to leave it there for this week. But since we started again up, we're going to keep these videos going. We really would like a bunch of subscribers. Did we get any, before we finish, did we get any comments or...
Yeah, we didn't have the window chat open,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
there were quite a few comments. There was a whole conversation going
A
on.
whole conversation going
Okay.
on? Any questions?
No
of-
questions that I
no
saw.
questions per se. That's because we have all the answers, right? Anyway,
Hubris, Joe.
hubris. We have only, yeah, whatever. No, it'll be good to have questions, though, if any questions come up, or if you think of any for next time. Just because whatever the show title is in any given day, you can ask any question that is off topic. It's not a big problem if you have anything that you'd like us to comment on or to think about. We don't need to have, we kind of keep tabs on most things, so we'll be able to at least give you a half reasonable answer to any given question. But also, if you, as many of you as possible, if you could subscribe, because there's a feature that opens up after we have more than 1,000 subscribers. It's a kind of it's called a super chat, and we'd like to get that running. So if you can subscribe, just click the button and click the like.
We have a special request. Bahar wrote on the chat that you haven't used the fish.
Where is it? What? Well, who do we want to use it on? I could use. Yeah, I don't know. Who do you think we should use it on? I just want. Yeah.
The problem is, if we do that, we might be inciting violence.
That might be. Yeah, exactly.
Guidelines.
Exactly. That might breach YouTube community guidelines to hit or suggest that anyone should be hit with a fish, even a rubber one.
In lieu of having, wearing holsters and making any kind of suggestions with that, as certain shows do, we have the fish.
Yeah.
In reserve.
In fact, I might actually get a double holster on it with 2 small fish in it, and just have them on me at all time in case I want to whip them out, and just brandish them. Yeah. So, like we said, yeah. Subscribe, like, whatever. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your comments, and we will see you pretty soon with another show.
Okay.
Hope you had fun. See ya.
Bye all.
Bye.
Where's our outro?
Can't stop the signal now.